Greetings. This is Chapter 2 of Business Ethics, and we're going to start diving into ethical principles so that you come to understand the different ethical lenses that we utilize to be able to make ethical decisions. There's not one right ethical lens to use. As you'll see, there are different approaches to focusing on ethical decision making. And our goal is to try to find solutions that reconcile all four lenses. For example, if we are looking at something from one perspective, let's say a utilitarian perspective, can we come up with a solution that not only addresses the issues that are concerning for utilitarians, but also for those people who are engaged in virtue ethics or justice theories or universalism. And those are the four major theories: utilitarianism, universalism, justice, and virtue ethics. So what we'll do is step by step go through this chapter, and you will come to understand those theories. And then we use these theories throughout the course to focus on different ethical concepts and learn how to apply them to all the business decisions that you're going to have to make. So to orient ourselves to what remains in this chapter and the rest of this PowerPoint lecture is that our goal is to really understand the different lenses that we can use to understand moral decision making. We all assume that we make decisions based on what we think is the right way to be, but when we think about morals and ethics, oftentimes they differ. The process differs from person to person how to get to moral outcomes. And so it is important for us to recognize which lens we might rely on as our default, and you're going to be doing that as part of your exercise for this module, but is to understand your ethical lens and how you can work to consider the world through different moral lenses and different moral points of view. So our goal really is to ensure that you understand the moral foundations, the foundations embedded in each of these ethical principles, and how we could apply them to a business context. And we'll get into that little by little to really understand ethics and applying ethical theories to business decisions. So we will be using 5 different ethical standards throughout this chapter to understand decision making. So we're going to talk about universal rights or universalism. We're going to talk about justice and fairness. We're going to talk about utility or utilitarianism, greatest good for the greatest number of people. Very much, if you're into science fiction and Star Trek, that's a Mr. Spock approach to things. We're going to talk about the culture of caring and how important it is to care for others. And then individual virtues and vices, and finding what we call the golden mean, finding that middle ground where it's not too excessive and not, deficient, but finding just the right sweet spot for what our community says is to be ethical or moral. And so each one of them are not perfect. They all have their strengths and weaknesses, and we're going to dive into those strengths and weaknesses. You are going to probably align with one or maybe more of these ethical lenses, because it is important for you to really identify, what are the tools that you use for making your own moral and ethical decisions? What are the ways that you go about considering data and considering information to be able to do that? We can apply this to the UNICAL case that's in your textbook, and while your textbook uses Burma, I prefer Myanmar. Myanmar is the term that people who live there prefer to call their country. It used to be called Burma. That was a colonial name that was attached to it, but it is actually known as Myanmar, so we will refer to it as Myanmar. And your case really gets at this cost-benefit analysis for what happened in Myanmar and how we consider different things. And I love that your textbook goes through this very organized approach about thinking about each of the different lenses. And at the end, it talks about um, whether or not, Myanmar should approach this from a utilitarian perspective, or from a caring perspective, or from a virtue ethics perspective. And you can see elements of this throughout the case. So as you read this, I want you to consider what aspects of virtue ethics do you see in there? What aspects of utilitarianism do you see in there? What aspects of caring ethics, caring culture do you see in there? And this is the approach that I want you to take for every case that we are dealing with from here on out, particularly your group decision cases, where you're going to be working through a case or a small problem and having to figure out what is the right approach to solving the problem, considering all sorts of different ethical lenses. So let's start talking about utilitarianism and the weight of balancing social costs and social benefits. The goal of utilitarianism is for us to find the greatest good for the greatest number of people. It wants to balance the value that if things happen in society against the costs for things happening in society. And the goal is to make decisions so that we maximize the good and we minimize the negative impact. And I think in some perspectives, utilitarianism is kind of realistic. It recognizes there's no perfect solution and that our goal should be to try to maximize the benefits for folks while doing things ethically and fairly without harming, as minimizing our harm as best as we can. And the textbook talks about Unical and how Unical uses a very utilitarian approach to things. And Unical, is not the only company that has engaged in sort of a utilitarian approach to things. That tends to be a very common ethical approach to decision making. And we see companies do this all the time because it's about cost-benefit analyses. And you've probably been taught these in your classes to do a cost-benefit analysis and how to maximize the benefits without increasing our costs. So one example of this is Ford Motor Company. And for many of you, obviously, you've either not heard of this or certainly I know you may be too old to remember this because I was a kid when this happened. But this was Ford Motor Company had a car called the Pinto. And the Pinto was supposed to be a certain weight and a certain size and a certain dollar point in order to be able to compete in the marketplace. And Lee Iacocca was the chairman and CEO of Ford Motor Company at that time, and he had a very clear vision about what he wanted the Ford Pinto to look like. And the problem was, after they had been designed the car and started getting it out on the market, they were having problems with the car exploding on impact. So let's say somebody rear-ended your car, the car would then catch on fire and would explode. Why would that happen? Because there was a design flaw in the bumper, and the bumper was set up. This is, of course, a time before we had fiberglass bumpers and things like that. But the bumper was made of metal and it had a bolt on it. And when the car was hit from behind, the bolt would pierce the gas tank that was at the back of the car. And so the cars would either start leaking gas or they'd go on fire and they'd explode. People were dying. And we come to find out as we dug into this, that Ford Pinto, that the Ford manufacturers on the Pinto knew that there was a design flaw. The designers actually said, this is a problem and we need to fix this. But because production had already been underway, Lee Iacocca said, we're going to not fix this because it's going to cost us too much money to fix this on every single car that's out there. We're just going to pay out the damages if someone sues us. That's a cheaper option for us. And they did this based on actuarial tables and looked at what the value was for the life or death or an accident of somebody. If you caught on fire and you died from from being on fire, if you had fire burns, right, you would have one payout. And if you lost a leg or an arm, that's a different payout. And they did all sorts of calculations on this, came up with a formula and said, yeah, it just makes better sense for us to let the accidents happen and to just pay the money. Now, the problem is, even though they might have looked at what the cost was based on actuarial tables, what they didn't take into account was the public opinion cost for the company. That once people started hearing that the company put dollar signs over safety, and recall that the person who was the president and the CEO at the time was Lee Iacocca, who in later years embraced safety, at this time did not believe that safety sold. In fact, he was quite clear. Safety doesn't sell. We don't care. We're going to sell this car at this price point with this weight, for this much money, and people are either going to buy it or they're not going to buy it. And we think that people are going to buy it because they want cheap, efficient cars. Needless to say, once the public opinion got out there, there was horrible outrage. People said, how could you dare put a cost to my wife or my son or my child or my wife or my husband's life? My family is worth more than your actuarial tables. And it became across as very cold and heartless without considering the impact that it would have on people. So, needless to say, Ford had to make some changes, and ultimately, at the end of the day, they realized that their decision was bad to only make a cost-benefit approach to things, and they eventually had to fix all the damages. Now, the worst part of it is the cost per car to fix the bolt was about $5. And so they would rather pay out thousands of dollars in damages to people for accidents versus the $5 per car that it took to fix it. Now, there were a lot of cars in the market, so $5 did add up. But that cost-benefit analysis, they forgot to take into account public opinion and public outrage when they realized that the car company did not care about, the impact of the accident and the damage on it. So that was a good hard lesson for Ford. It took them decades to recover from that. And obviously now they have a better reputation out there. But for years, there were lots of jokes about what what Ford meant as a, FORD, fix or repair daily, or, there's a word that you could use for F, like blank on a raw deal, F on a raw deal, I guess is a better way of putting it without saying the words directly. And so there was a lot of jokes out there for that acronym, right? What does FORD stand for? Yes, we know it stands for Henry Ford, but people were using it as an acronym to say, Ford doesn't care about us, and we've been, screwed over on a raw deal from Ford because they don't care about safety issues. So, of course, there's lots of joking that happened around that. But they've recovered. They realized that it was important to put safety first, and Lee Iacocca learned his lesson, and he became the standard bearer for safety in Detroit in the car industry. He believed in seatbelts and all sorts of other things, and he really helped change the industry after he was basically taught, after he basically got hurt, politically speaking and reputationally speaking, by allowing the Ford Pinto debacle to go on for as long as it did. So let's talk a little bit about traditional utilitarianism. Traditional utilitarianism came from two basic philosophers, Jeremy Bentham and Mill. They were both the founders of the theory of utilitarianism, and the goal and the ideas behind utilitarianism is that we want to maximize pleasure, minimize pain, and make sure that we don't harm anybody as much as we are able to do, and so do the best we can to keep people safe. And so utilitarianism is very much like that Mr. Spock approach things. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, which means we do what we can to benefit as many people as possible. and recognizing that the downside of utilitarianism is that there are still going to be people who are going to be negatively affected by, utilitarianism and by a decision that an organization makes. So Bentham and Mills were really getting at this notion of how we have to have a more objective point of view for making ethical decisions, and what was a great ethical basis was happiness versus pain, or benefits versus costs, and that was the best way to guide us through some ethical decision making. Of course, it's not clear, right, that ethical decision making can always be broken down into good versus bad, or benefit over cost. There are some decisions that we might argue, and these are some of the criticisms of it, right, that we might argue, is it right for us to harm anybody no matter what? That maybe there are more universalistic approaches to the way we think about some of our actions and some of our decisions. And we'll talk about each of those theories, in kind, but Mill says actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they produce the reverse of happiness, which would be unhappiness or pain. And it's just not easy to think about all potential options to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. It just doesn't work that way quite readily. So the goal, of course, of utilitarianism is to really do our best to minimize the pain that we invoke on people. So you have to recognize that some of the mistakes are associated with utilitarianism is that the assumption is that the right action is the one where the benefits outweigh the costs. But sometimes we have to stand up for the people who are hurt the most. And there's all different theories around that. So there is some flaw in this notion that the only principle that matters is, as long as the benefits outweigh the cost, everything's fine. Because that's pretty much what Ford Motor Company did. They said the benefits of having the Pinto out there and the money we'll make from it is offset against the cost that it will take us to settle all these lawsuits. And so they decided, based on their calculation, that that was the right answer, that was the right action. And as we saw, of course, that was not the right action. And it also assumes that the utility is just for the person who's performing the action, whereas the utility is really the impact that it has on everybody. And there are many people that have an impact on this. Considerations are only of direct and immediate consequences. It doesn't take into account long-term impact. For example, General Electric, years ago, when they had wastes from their power plants, would dump the PCBs into the Hudson River because they thought, this is a great, immediate, direct benefit for us. We get rid of the problem, and we don't have any problems, with our waste products, because they'll go in the river, and we don't have to worry about the river because it's not going to have any impact on the river. And so what they didn't realize is what we call externalities, that there was an impact on doing that. And at the end of the day, it affected fish, it affected wildlife, it affected human beings, because the PCBs in the water were not healthy. Because the water fed so many people, because people fish from the river, they want to eat from the river, eat the fish that they grow from the river, etc. So we have to be careful of externalities, which are factors that we didn't take into account when we made our short-term decision, because externalities tend to be more long-term. That they may not, the outcome may not pop up now, but it will pop up later when we're thinking about these things. And so there are some great real-world applications of this. You'll see in your textbook the comments by Lawrence Sumner's that said that the waste from rich companies should be sent to poor companies, because he believed from a utilitarian perspective that this was the best approach to things. But as we can see, that's not necessarily the case. So take some time to read through the Lawrence Sumner case and to see how utilitarianism was the tool that he used and what those flaws were in the utilitarianism.